There is a man who described your world before you were born, not as prophecy, not through mysticism or divine inspiration or any of the usual channels through which people claim to know what the future holds. He described it through careful observation of the present he was standing in, extrapolated forward with the precision of a man who had grown up in a house full of scientists and who understood, more deeply than most of his contemporaries, where the logic of certain developments was leading. He described a world in which people were not controlled by force but by pleasure.
In which the most sophisticated instrument of social management was not the prison or the rifle, but the provision of continuous entertainment and the chemical elimination of discomfort. In which freedom had not been taken away, but had been voluntarily surrendered, traded for the convenience of not having to make difficult choices, not having to sit with difficult feelings, not having to develop the kind of self that only emerges through genuine struggle. He described this world in 1932. He watched it arriving for the next 40 years. He wrote about it, lectured about it, warned about it, and was largely ignored in the specific way that prophets are ignored.
His books were read and celebrated as literature. His ideas were discussed and praised as interesting. And the world went on building exactly what he had described, one comfortable increment at a time. Aldous Huxley was not simply a novelist. He was one of the most comprehensive minds of the 20th century, a biologist's grandson who wrote fiction with scientific precision, a mystic who reasoned with clinical clarity, a satirist who was genuinely afraid of what he was satirizing, a man who spent his life at the intersection of art and science and spirituality and politics and who understood each of those domains well enough to see what the others were missing. He was the visionary no one wanted to listen to. Not because he was wrong, because he was right about things that were more comfortable to leave unexamined. Today, we follow his life and his ideas through three movements: the formation, the vision, and the search. The House of Minds. Aldous Leonard Huxley was born on July 26, 1894, in Godalming, Surrey, into a family that the word distinguished does not adequately describe. The Huxley family was not merely prominent. It was, in a specific and unusual sense, a dynasty of intelligence, a family in which intellectual achievement across multiple disciplines had been the baseline expectation for 2 generations, and in which Aldous arrived already surrounded by a legacy that would have overwhelmed anyone less constitutionally serious. His grandfather was Thomas Henry Huxley, one of the great biologists of the Victorian era, the man who became known as Darwin's bulldog, for the ferocity with which he defended the theory of evolution against religious and scientific opposition, when Darwin himself preferred to remain in the background. Thomas Henry Huxley had debated bishops, dissected sharks, coined the word agnostic, and transformed British science education. He was a man who believed that the honest examination of evidence was the highest intellectual virtue, regardless of where the evidence led. His father, Leonard Huxley, was a writer and editor, less flamboyant than the grandfather, but serious and literate. A man whose household was filled with books and visitors of distinction. His mother, Julia Arnold, was the niece of Matthew Arnold, the poet and cultural critic whose phrase, "the best that has been thought and said," defined a particular Victorian ideal of what education should accomplish. When Aldous Huxley wrote about the relationship between culture and civilization, between genuine learning and the performance of learning, he was drawing on a family inheritance that went back decades. He had brothers, Julian and Trevignan, both remarkable. Julian became one of the leading biologists and science communicators of the 20th century, the first Director General of UNESCO, a man who coined the term transhumanism and who brought to public communication of science the same combination of rigor and accessibility that ran through the family. Trevelyan died young, at the age of 24, from a crisis of depression that destroyed him quietly, while the family watched helplessly. Aldous grew up in this atmosphere of exceptional minds engaged with the most important questions of the era, and he absorbed it with an appetite that was clearly apparent from early childhood. He was reading voraciously before most children were managing sentences. He had the specific quality of the genuinely gifted child, who is not performing intelligence but simply operating at a different speed than the surrounding environment, processing more, connecting more, asking questions that the adults around him sometimes could not answer. Then, at 16, catastrophe arrived. The darkness that made him, in 1908, when Aldous was 14, his mother Julia died of cancer. She was 45 years old. The loss was shattering in the way that the death of a parent at a formative age reshapes everything. The sense of what is permanent, what can be counted on, what the world owes you. Then when he was 16, his eyes failed. He contracted keratitis punctata, an inflammation of the cornea, while at Eton. Within 18 months, he was functionally blind. He could perceive light and shadow. He could not read. He could not recognize faces. He could not do the thing that had been, from early childhood, his primary mode of engaging with the world, and with the extraordinary library of human thought he had been working his way through. He learned Braille. He learned to type. He had his textbooks read to him by other students and returned the favor by helping them with essays. He adapted with a tenacity that was either courage or stubbornness, or some compound of both, and when his vision partially recovered, he used it with the specific intensity of a person who knows exactly what its absence cost. The experience of near blindness left permanent marks. It gave him first-hand knowledge of the fragility of the faculties on which human identity depends, of how quickly the self loses its bearings when those capacities are removed. It gave him a relationship with the physical world that was different from people who had always taken their senses for granted.
More deliberate, more appreciative, more aware of the specific texture of experience as something that could be present or absent.
And it gave him, perhaps the beginning of his lifelong interest in consciousness itself, in the question of what experience actually is, and how it relates to the biological machinery that produces it. His vision never fully recovered. He wore thick spectacles for the rest of his life and carried a small magnifying glass for reading fine print. In 1942, he published The Art of Seeing, a book about his experience with visual improvement techniques. It was controversial and probably overstated the results, but it was characteristic. Huxley would not accept a limitation without investigating every possible avenue of response to it. Oxford and the making of a writer. His vision recovered enough for him to study at Balliol College, Oxford, which he entered in 1913. He read English literature, which was in some respects too narrow for a mind as wide as his, but which gave him the systematic engagement with the Western literary tradition that he had been pursuing informally since childhood. Oxford, in the years immediately before and during the First World War, was an institution in suspended catastrophe. The young men who arrived in autumn 1913 were among the last to receive the full, uninterrupted education the university had been delivering for centuries. The cohort that followed was diminished by war, and the generation that would have gone to university between 1914 and 1918 was largely in the trenches instead. Huxley could not serve in the military because of his vision. This fact, which saved his life, also gave him a vantage point on the war that was different from his contemporaries. He watched the slaughter from outside, watched his generation destroyed, watched the assumptions of Victorian progress dissolve in the mud of the Western Front. He processed this not through combat experience, but through the intellectual and moral devastation of watching a culture commit what looked, from a distance, like collective madness. After Oxford, he worked briefly as a teacher at Eton, finding it congenial in some respects and suffocating in others. He had already begun writing seriously, publishing poetry, essays, and from 1921, the novels that would make his reputation. Chrome Yellow, his first novel, appeared when he was 27. It was witty, satirical, deeply literary, and immediately recognized as the work of an unusual talent. Antic Hay, Point Counterpoint, and Those Barren Leaves followed in quick succession. He was recognized as one of the most brilliant literary voices of his generation, and he had not yet written the book that would define him. He had married Maria Nice, a young Belgian woman he had met during the war years, in 1919. She was his companion, his driver, his reader, his buffer between his extraordinary internal world and the external demands of a literary career. She read to him for hours daily because his vision never fully allowed sustained reading. She drove him across America and Europe when he was at his most productive. She was, by all accounts, a person of genuine intelligence and remarkable commitment, and Huxley was genuinely dependent on her in ways he was not always fully able to express. The moment on the factory floor. In 1926, Huxley and Maria traveled to America. He had been offered a position writing for a magazine, and they crossed the Atlantic with the combination of excitement and wariness that European intellectuals typically brought to the New World. Curious about the energy of it, skeptical about the direction that energy was taking. He visited the Ford automobile plant in Detroit. He stood on the factory floor and watched the assembly line produce cars with the rhythmic, inhuman efficiency that Ford's innovation had made possible. Every worker performed one specific repeated action. Every action interlocked with every other in a system so precisely calibrated that the end of each cycle produced a finished automobile as though the process were a natural phenomenon rather than a human arrangement. Huxley stood there and felt something he would spend the next 6 years turning into a book. He saw the logic of the assembly line applied not just to cars but to people. He saw what happened when human beings were made to fit the requirements of the system, rather than the system being made to fit the requirements of human beings. He saw the efficiency possible when you optimize for output, rather than for the flourishing of the individuals doing the work. And he saw with the specific clarity of a man raised in a household of scientists, where that logic would lead if applied consistently, if extended from the factory floor to the human being themselves, from the organization of work to the organization of desire. He began writing what would become Brave New World in 1931 and completed it in 4 months. He was 37 years old and at the peak of his literary powers. The book was published in 1932 and has not been out of print since. What Brave New World actually said. The mistake most people make about Brave New World is to read it as a book about government tyranny. This reading is not wrong, but it misses the sharper point. The world state in the novel does not maintain control through fear. There are no secret police in the conventional sense, no torture chambers, no midnight arrests. The control is far more elegant and far more difficult to resist than anything that operates through terror. The world state maintains control through the engineering of desire itself, through the production of people who want exactly what the system needs them to want, and who experience this wanting as freedom. Huxley was not writing about an external enemy. He was writing about an internal one. The threat he identified was not the state imposing itself on the individual, but the individual voluntarily reconstructing themselves in the image of what the state requires, finding the reconstruction pleasant and calling the pleasantness happiness. This is a distinction that his contemporaries and most subsequent readers found genuinely difficult to hold clearly. Orwell's 1984, published 17 years later, depicted a world of visible terror, of Big Brother watching from screens, of torture and the brutal machinery of open oppression. It is a powerful and accurate warning about one kind of tyranny. Huxley wrote to Orwell after reading it, praising the book and gently suggesting that his own vision was the more likely one. Not because governments lacked the will to be brutal, but because pleasure was a more efficient instrument of control than pain. Pain creates martyrs. Pleasure creates consumers. And consumers are far easier to manage than martyrs. The specific mechanisms of the world state deserve attention because they are not science fiction. They are extrapolations of things that already existed in 1932 and that have since become much more fully developed. Human beings are produced in hatcheries rather than born, because birth is messy, unpredictable, and creates emotional bonds between mother and child that the state cannot control. The conditioning begins before birth, continues through childhood, and is so thoroughly internalized that by adulthood the citizens of the world state do not experience their conditioning as limitation. They experience it as identity. Soma, the mood-altering substance distributed by the state, produces no hangover and no painful dependency. It simply relieves whatever discomfort arises from contact with reality and replaces it with a pleasant neutrality. It is the perfect instrument. It works without apparent cost. And because it works without apparent cost, there is no rational argument against taking it. The person who points out that Soma prevents genuine engagement with life is pointing out something that the Soma taker finds perfectly agreeable and entirely irrelevant. The feelies, the sensory cinematic experience that surrounds the audience in carefully calibrated sensation, provide the experience of experience without the risk of genuine experience. You feel what the filmmakers intend you to feel. Nothing unexpected, nothing difficult, nothing genuinely your own. Sex is freely available and emotionally meaningless, because emotional meaning in sexual relationships creates the kind of intense personal attachment that leads to possessiveness and the formation of small, intense groups that might develop loyalties stronger than their loyalty to the world state. By making sex casual and universal, the state ensures that the energy of sexuality bonds no one in particular. Art, literature, philosophy, religion, anything that produces genuine discomfort, that makes demands on the person experiencing it, that might provoke genuine thought or genuine questioning of the conditions of one's existence, has been eliminated. What remains is entertainment, sensation without challenge, feeling without meaning, the experience of having experienced without any change in the experiencer. Huxley's horror was not that this world was cruel. It was that it was pleasant, and that pleasantness was the most complete form of unfreedom he could imagine, because it left its subjects with nothing to push against. There is a specific kind of horror that the novel produces in careful readers, and that is different from the horror produced by 1984 or Fahrenheit 451. Those books present obvious enemies: the totalitarian state, the burning of books, the visible machinery of oppression. The horror they produce is the horror of recognizing something you can identify as wrong, something you can point at and name. Brave New World produces a different kind of discomfort, slower and more insidious. The recognition that the wrong thing is not obviously wrong, that it is wrapped in genuine pleasure, genuine comfort, genuine absence of pain, and that the argument against it requires you to claim that something is missing, even when the person whose life it is does not feel the absence. This is the most difficult argument to make in any domain, that something is lacking when the person affected does not experience the lack. The world state's citizens are not suffering. They are genuinely content. To tell them that their contentment is a form of diminishment, that the absence of difficulty is itself a kind of poverty, requires a standard of human flourishing that goes beyond subjective satisfaction, a standard that says some ways of living are objectively fuller than others, regardless of how they feel from the inside. Huxley believed this standard existed. He spent the rest of his life trying to articulate it, but he was honest enough to acknowledge that articulating it clearly was enormously difficult, because the standard could not be derived from pleasure and pain alone, could not be reduced to what people wanted or what made them feel good. Had to appeal to something about what human beings were, what they were capable of, what they were missing when they were never given the chance to be genuinely challenged and genuinely shaped by the challenge. The world state had resolved this problem by eliminating the question. Mond's citizens cannot miss what they have never known. The savage, who knows something different, is destroyed by the encounter with a world that has no place for him. And the reader, watching this, is left with the uncomfortable task of deciding, is the savage right that something essential has been removed? Or is Mond right that the essential things were suffering and instability, and that their removal is simply gain? The controller's argument.
Character in Brave New World who most directly articulates the philosophy of the world state is Mustafa Mond, the resident world controller for Western Europe. Mond is not a villain in any conventional sense. He is intelligent, cultured, and entirely honest. He has read the books that the world state has suppressed. He understands the arguments for genuine freedom, for art, for religion, for the kind of life that has depth because it has difficulty.
He has simply decided that the trade-off is not worth making on behalf of the population he governs. His argument is this: genuine human freedom produces genuine human suffering. The capacity for deep love produces the capacity for devastating loss. The ability to think seriously about existence produces the ability to despair about it. The conditions that make Shakespeare possible are conditions of conflict, suffering, and the kind of intense personal experience that the world state has eliminated. You can have Shakespeare or you can have stability. You cannot have both. Mond has chosen stability for everyone. He believes with the genuine conviction of a man who has read the evidence that most people given the honest choice would choose stability too. They would choose comfort over depth. They would choose the Soma holiday over the genuine encounter with grief. They would choose the feelie over the play that leaves them unsettled for days. What Huxley was really writing about was the question of what human beings are for. The world state has an answer. They are for the smooth functioning of the system that produces and maintains them. Mond's stability is not a tyranny of the obvious kind. It is a tyranny of the answer, A world in which the question of what human life is for has been settled in advance, efficiently, pleasantly, and permanently. The savage, John, the character formed outside the world state by genuine experience, argues for the right to be unhappy.
He wants difficulty. He wants the full encounter with life, including its worst parts. Mond concedes the point philosophically and denies it practically. What Mond cannot answer, and what the novel leaves open as its deepest wound, is whether the savage is right that something essential has been removed from the citizens of the world state, or whether Mond is right that they have simply been spared suffering that produces nothing worth the cost.
Brave New World Revisited, the alarm gets louder.
In 1958, 26 years after Brave New World, Huxley published Brave New World Revisited, a non-fiction companion that examined how much closer the world had moved to his fictional vision.
The book opens with a sentence that should have stopped people cold. The prophesied future is now arriving much sooner than he had expected. He identified 5 specific developments that alarmed him. Overpopulation, creating conditions for authoritarian management. The rise of what he called the science of manipulation, the systematic development of techniques for influencing behavior below the level of rational consent. The use of pharmacological agents to manage mood, the growth of subhuman conditioning through advertising and mass media, and the increasing concentration of economic and political power in ways that made genuine democratic participation increasingly nominal. He was writing this in 1958.
Before personal computers, before smartphones, before social media algorithms, before the pharmaceutical revolution that made mood management a commercially vast industry, before the concentration of media ownership that would eventually make a handful of corporations responsible for the information environment of most of the world's population. He was seeing the early chapters of a story he had already written. And he was alarmed not because the developments were sudden, but because they were incremental. Because each individual step was plausible and even reasonable. Because the people implementing them were not evil, but efficient. Because the result of 1,000 individually defensible decisions was the kind of world he had spent 26 years trying to warn people about. He had a gift for identifying the logic of a process before the process had completed. He could look at a tendency that was still modest and trace it forward with sufficient honesty to see where it was heading. This is the specific form of intelligence that the world finds most uncomfortable. Not the person who tells you something is wrong after it has become obvious, but the person who tells you something is going wrong while it still looks harmless, while the individual steps still look reasonable, while you can still make a different choice. The politics of the warning. Huxley was not easily categorized politically, which made him inconvenient to audiences across the spectrum. The political left found him suspicious because he was skeptical of large-scale collectivist programs, because he believed that the state, regardless of its stated intentions, was always a potential instrument of the kind of control he had described in the novel. The political right found him equally suspicious because he was skeptical of corporate capitalism's tendency to produce the same kind of managed, desire-engineered population through commercial rather than governmental means. He understood, as few of his contemporaries did, that the consumer society and the totalitarian society shared a fundamental orientation. Both were organized around the management of human beings as resources to be optimized. Both required the suppression of genuine individuality in favor of predictable, manageable behavior, and both used pleasure as a primary instrument of that management. The mechanism differed. The outcome was remarkably similar. He was also suspicious of nationalism in every form, having watched it produce 2 world wars within his lifetime. He was suspicious of religious institutions while being deeply interested in religious experience. He was suspicious of science when it presented itself as a complete account of reality, while being deeply committed to scientific rigor as a method. This political homelessness was philosophically consistent. The consistent thread in Huxley's thinking was not a political position, but a question. What conditions actually allow a human being to develop their full potential? What kind of environment, what kind of education, what kind of social arrangement actually produces human beings who are genuinely free in the sense of being genuinely themselves, rather than efficiently managed versions of what someone else needed them to be? This question was not answerable by any existing political ideology, and Huxley knew it. He spent the second half of his life looking for answers in places that the political mainstream considered irrelevant: California and the Second Life. In 1937, Huxley and Maria left England for California, initially intending a lecture tour, and finding gradually that they had no inclination to return. They settled first in Los Angeles and then at the edge of the Mojave Desert, in a house outside the small town of Llano, where the light was extraordinary and the distance from the social pressures of literary London felt like genuine relief. California, in the late 1930s and 1940s, was a remarkable meeting point for European refugees from the rise of fascism, for Eastern teachers who had begun arriving in America in significant numbers, for scientists working at the edge of what was understood about consciousness and perception, for artists and writers doing things that more established cultural centers found eccentric or incomprehensible. Huxley was writing constantly: essays, novels, screenplays for the film industry that paid well and interested him moderately, and philosophical and scientific investigations that paid nothing and interested him completely. He was reading voraciously across every field that touched his central preoccupations: biology, psychology, pharmacology, the comparative study of religious experience across traditions, the emerging science of perception and its relationship to the brain. He had become, by the early 1940s, genuinely engaged by the question that his fiction had circled without quite landing on directly. Not what does the world look like if human beings are managed rather than developed, but what does genuine human development actually consist of? What is the state of consciousness that produces a person who is genuinely free, genuinely themselves, capable of the kind of experience that the world-state citizens had been designed to never encounter? He was looking for something real. He was following the thread with the same systematic attention he brought to everything, regardless of where that thread ran. The perennial philosophy. In 1945, Huxley published The Perennial Philosophy, which many consider his most important non-fiction contribution. It is an anthology of mystical writings from across the world's religious traditions, assembled and connected by Huxley's commentary, organized around the argument that beneath the apparently radical diversity of religious form and doctrine, there is a common core of insight that has been reached independently by serious practitioners of inner development in every culture and every era. The core, as Huxley assembled it, is something like this: the ordinary human ego, the self we experience in daily life, is not the whole of what we are. Behind or beneath the ego, accessible through disciplines of contemplation and attention developed across many traditions, is something that the traditions describe in various ways, as Atman, as Buddha nature, as the inner light, as the ground of being. This something is not separate from the divine but continuous with it. The mystic does not encounter God as a separate being but discovers through the removal of the ordinary obstacles of ego and craving that the deepest reality is one and that the individual self participates in that oneness. Huxley's approach to this material was not the approach of a believer defending a faith. It was the approach of a comparativist asking, what is the common structure of these experiences? What has been independently discovered by people with no contact with each other across thousands of years, using radically different conceptual frameworks? If the same core insight keeps appearing in such radically different contexts, is that not evidence that it is pointing at something real? He was explicit that he was not endorsing any particular religious tradition. He was identifying what he believed was a genuine form of knowledge, a knowledge of the nature of consciousness and its relation to reality, accumulated through rigorous practice over millennia that the modern world had almost entirely discarded in favor of a scientific materialism that was excellent at answering certain questions and almost entirely silent on the questions he cared most about.
The perennial philosophy was Huxley's attempt to reconnect the intellectual tradition he had grown up in with a dimension of human experience that tradition had increasingly dismissed. He believed the dismissal was a mistake, and that the price of the mistake was the kind of world Brave New World had described, a world that had mastered the technology of the outer and remained almost entirely ignorant of the technology of the inner.
Through the doors of perception. In 1953, Huxley took mescaline for the first time under the supervision of the psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond in his house in Los Angeles. He was 58 years old. He had been interested in the pharmacology of consciousness for years. The research emerging on what were then being called psychedelics, substances that produced dramatic alterations in conscious experience, interested him both as a biologist's grandson and as a philosopher of mind. He was not approaching the experiment as recreation or escape. He was approaching it as an investigation. The experience lasted several hours and was recorded in careful notes that became, the following year, The Doors of Perception, one of the most influential short books of the 20th century. He described the extraordinary intensification of visual experience, the way ordinary objects became radiant with what felt like intrinsic significance, the dissolution of the usual cognitive filters that reduced the richness of sensory experience to the manageable signal required for ordinary functioning. He drew on the philosopher Henry Bergson's idea that the brain functions not primarily as a producer of consciousness, but as a reducing valve, a mechanism that filters down the infinite richness of possible experience to the narrow band useful for survival and social functioning. Most of what the world presents to the senses is filtered out before it reaches consciousness. What we ordinarily experience is the edited version, the version that allows efficient functioning.
The mescaline, Huxley proposed, had temporarily opened the valve, allowing more of the signal through. The experience convinced him of something he had been intellectually committed to, but not yet personally certain about. That the mystical experience described across the world's contemplative traditions was not a delusion or a hallucination, but a genuine form of perception. The perception of reality with the ordinary filters reduced. The meditating monk and the mescaline taker were, through different means, accessing something similar. A mode of experience in which the self is less dominant and reality is more fully present. The Doors of Perception was read by millions of people with no particular interest in philosophy or pharmacology, because it described an altered state with a vividness and intellectual seriousness that most accounts of such experiences completely lacked.
It influenced the counterculture of the 1960s in ways that Huxley found both gratifying and alarming.
Gratifying. The openness to exploring consciousness. Alarming. The tendency to treat the exploration as recreation rather than as serious investigation, to take the experience without doing the work that would allow it to be genuinely integrated. He was always clear about what the substances were not. They were not enlightenment. They were at most a glimpse, a temporary opening that showed you something difficult to see with the ordinary filters in place, but that left the actual work of developing the capacity to access that something through one's own resources entirely undone. The vision without the practice was, at best, a motivation. At worst, a comfortable substitute for the real work.
Island, the world he wanted. In 1962, Huxley published his last novel. He called it Island, and it was the positive counterpart to Brave New World. Not the warning, but the alternative. Not the world, produced by the logic of management and control, but the world produced by the genuine application of human intelligence to the question of how people could actually live well. The island of Palau is a fictional place in the Indian Ocean where, over the course of a century, a Scottish physician and an enlightened local king had collaborated to build a society organized around a single question: what does genuine human development require? They had drawn on Western science and Eastern contemplative traditions, on experimental education and pharmacological research, on ecological principles and political philosophy, and had produced something genuinely different from any existing society.
The Palanese do not use soma. They use a substance called moksha medicine, derived from mushrooms, administered at specific points in education as a sacrament, a tool for expanding perception, used in a context of preparation and integration, never as an escape from reality, but as a deeper encounter with it. The difference from soma is total. Soma is used to avoid experience. Moksha medicine is used to intensify it. The children of Palau are educated not to fit the requirements of an economic system, but to develop their full human potential. They learn to pay attention to their bodies, to their emotions, to the natural world, to each other. They learn the difference between genuine need and conditioned craving. They learn to be fully present to what is actually happening rather than lost in the narrative of what is supposed to be happening. The society is not utopian in the sense of being conflict-free or perfect. It is human. People suffer, make mistakes, fail each other. But the culture is oriented toward the development of the person rather than the management of the person, and the difference this makes to the quality of life, Huxley suggests, is the difference between a life worth living and a comfortable and pleasant approximation of one. The book was generally received as a disappointment compared to Brave New World, and that assessment has largely stuck. Critics found the positive vision less convincing than the negative one, less dramatically interesting, less precisely observed. Dystopia is easier to make vivid than genuine flourishing, because the imagination of horror is more accessible than the imagination of a life fully lived, which requires some experience of it to recognize. But Island is worth more attention than its reputation suggests. It is not a blueprint. It is a set of unasked questions. What if education was designed for human development rather than economic utility? What if the relationship between tradition and innovation was understood as complementary rather than competitive? What if pleasure and meaning were considered together rather than as alternatives? What if the approach to dying was treated with the same seriousness as the approach to living? Huxley did not think these were unanswerable. He thought they were unasked.
The last year and the last lesson. In 1960, Huxley was diagnosed with cancer of the tongue. He was 66 years old. The disease progressed slowly enough to allow him several more years of work, but the diagnosis changed the quality of his attention to the questions he had always cared about. He was no longer examining death as a philosophical problem. He was approaching it as an immediate reality. Maria had died in 1955, also of cancer, after 36 years of marriage. The loss was devastating in a way that his characteristic equanimity struggled to contain. He had married again in 1956, the Italian violinist and psychotherapist Laura Archera, who became in the final years his closest companion and the witness to his last experiment. He had spent years studying accounts of the dying process, reading research on what happens at the boundary of life, examining the contemplative tradition's accounts of what death consists of and how it might be best approached. He had been influenced by the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a text designed as a guide for the dying, and by the emerging work of researchers studying near-death experiences. On November 22, 1963, Aldous Huxley died. The date is notable because it was the same day that John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas, an event so overwhelming that Huxley's death was largely swallowed by the news cycle. He was 69 years old. Laura was with him. In his final hours, Huxley asked her to administer a measured dose of a substance he had prepared for. He had spent years arguing that the approach to death was as important as the approach to life, that the quality of attention brought to the final passage mattered, and he intended to approach his own death as he had approached everything else, consciously, deliberately, with as much awareness as he could bring to it. He died in the afternoon, quietly.
Laura described his face in his final hours as clear and peaceful, the expression of a man who was present to what was happening rather than fleeing from it. He had been consistent to the end. He met his death the way he had met every other subject of genuine importance, as something to be examined directly without flinching, without the comfort of looking away.
What he saw that we are still ignoring.
Huxley spent his life investigating the gap between what human beings are and what they could be, between the world we have built and the world that a genuine application of intelligence to the question of human flourishing might produce. He identified the gap with more precision than almost any of his contemporaries, and he named what was filling it with the same precision. Not cruelty, not obvious evil, but the accumulation of small and individually defensible choices, each of which moved the needle slightly toward a world organized around the management of desire rather than the development of persons. The management of desire is more powerful than the management of behavior because it operates upstream. Once you can shape what people want, you no longer need to control what they do. They will do, freely and voluntarily, exactly what the system needs them to do. And they will call this freedom because no one compelled them, because they chose it, because the choosing felt exactly like being themselves. This is the warning that nobody wanted to hear, not because it was false, but because it implicated everyone. It was not pointing at a tyrant or a foreign enemy or an obvious villain. It was pointing at the ordinary daily life of ordinary people in ordinary wealthy societies, at the entertainment consumed, the substances taken, the attention sold, the difficulty avoided, the comfort chosen over the hard and unrewarding work of becoming genuinely oneself.
Huxley's answer to this was not political. He was too honest about the limitations of political solutions to believe that a different government or a different economic arrangement would, by itself, produce human beings capable of genuine freedom. The problem was deeper than politics. It was cultural, educational, psychological, spiritual in the broadest sense. It required working at the level of consciousness, of attention, of the individual's capacity to be genuinely present to their own experience rather than continuously managed away from it. He was right that this was hard to sell. It demanded something that the world state and its real-world approximations were specifically designed to prevent: the sustained, honest, uncomfortable engagement with the question of what you actually are, what you actually want, and what kind of life would actually constitute a human life fully lived. He is still right. The world he warned about has not arrived all at once, with a clear sign announcing its completion. It has been arriving in increments, in the specific forms he identified, in the pharmacological management of discomfort, in the algorithmically engineered provision of continuous sensation, in educational systems designed for economic utility rather than human development, in the political discourse that operates through emotional management rather than honest argument. Each increment is small enough to be individually defensible. The total is what he described in 1932 and watched approaching for the next 40 years and continued warning about until he had no more breath to warn with. The question he spent his life asking is still unanswered, still largely unasked in the places where it matters most. What are human beings actually for? Not what are they useful for? Not what do they want, given what they have been conditioned to want. What are they for if you take seriously the possibility that they have a nature, a potential, a range of development that most of them, in most of the worlds they have actually inhabited, never come close to reaching? He thought the answer existed. He spent his life looking for it in science, in literature, in the contemplative traditions, in the pharmacology of consciousness, in the accounts of the dying, in the mystics and the biologists and the poets and the children who had not yet been fully conditioned into the reduced version of themselves that the world found most manageable. He found enough to be convinced the search was worth continuing. He did not find enough to finish it. He left it, as he left everything, as an open question addressed to anyone serious enough to receive it. The visionary no one wanted to listen to is still speaking. The question is whether, this time, anyone is paying attention.